Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a topic that affects literally billions of lives, yet honestly is often fundamentally misunderstood. We're going to be looking at the anatomy of poverty. Specifically, we'll dive into exactly how global and national institutions attempt to, well, quantify human struggle. It's a pretty fascinating intersection of economics, public policy, and actual human reality. So let's get into it.
So let me ask you this. Is poverty just about having no money? Right? It sounds like a super simple question, but we actually need to challenge our basic assumptions right out of the gate here. I mean, we usually default to thinking of poverty purely as a bank balance of zero. But as we'll see through the definitions today, poverty is a much more complex, multidimensional issue. It's not just a lack of cash. It's really a lack of capability.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. Number 1, defining multidimensional poverty. Number 2, absolute versus relative poverty. And number 3, India's poverty line mechanics.
Starting with Section 1, defining multidimensional poverty, more than empty pockets.
Okay, let's dive into this. The United Nations Development Program actually proposes an idea that completely flips how we view deprivation. They argue that poverty goes way beyond just a material lack, right? To really grasp this, we have to contrast income poverty with human poverty. Income poverty is that traditional view, the lack of material necessities. Imagine a family that literally cannot afford basic flour and cooking oil to make dinner. But human poverty? That is the denial of opportunities for a tolerable life. Picture a bright, eager kid who just can't attend school or even get to a local health clinic. Sure, they might have food on the table tonight, but their potential? It's entirely locked away.
So multidimensional poverty is officially defined as the denial of opportunities to live a tolerable, long, healthy, and creative life, right alongside a lack of decent living standards. The absolute crucial point here is that true poverty actually prevents someone from living a creative and healthy life. It completely strips away a person's agency. And it's super vital we understand this foundational concept of denied opportunity before we look at the cold, hard math of how poverty is traditionally measured.
Moving on to Section 2, absolute versus relative poverty, the comparative matrix. Let's look at how economists categorize all this globally.
When putting poverty into categories, economists essentially look at two very distinct realities. First, you have absolute poverty. This means you are fundamentally unable to meet basic survival needs. Think of a landless agricultural laborer in a developing nation who literally cannot secure daily meals or even basic shelter. It is a life or death threshold. But then, on the other hand, we have relative poverty. This is when an individual's income is distinctively below the average economic standard of their specific society. Imagine someone making, say, $20,000 a year in a highly developed nation where the average per capita income is $70,000, right? They might have basic food, but they are totally economically and socially excluded compared to their peers.
Now, what's really interesting about this distinction is where it leads us economically. Absolute poverty standards remain consistent over time because, well, it's a biological baseline of human survival. Because of that, its complete eradication is theoretically possible. We could actually fix it. But relative poverty? That's measured by comparing an individual against the average per capita income of their society, which makes it a constantly shifting target. As a country gets richer, the average goes up. So mathematically speaking, relative poverty cannot be completely eradicated because there is always going to be a bottom percentile in any income distribution.
All right, Section 3, India's poverty line mechanics, grounding theory in reality.
To see how governments actually draw a line in the sand with all this, let's look at India's historical methodology as a really fascinating real-world case study. By definition, a poverty line is the income level just sufficient to buy the basic minimum quantity of food and a few select non-food items. What is absolutely crucial to note here is that the Planning Commission of India, back when they originally fixed this line in 1978, defined it almost entirely in terms of food poverty. They were not measuring that broader human poverty we were just talking about. No, they were measuring the absolute bare minimum required for physical, biological survival.
And how did they measure that survival? In calories. In 1978, the baseline nutritional requirement was set at 2,400 calories per day for rural areas, but only 2,100 calories per day for urban areas. Now, you might be wondering, why the difference? Well, economists pointed out that rural populations actually required a higher caloric intake because they were heavily engaged in grueling manual physical labor, things like tilling fields and hauling. That's compared to the relatively more sedentary or semi-physical work you'd usually find in urban environments.
Okay, so they had the calorie target, but what was the actual cost? In 1978, the head count ratio determined that to afford those basic calories, the poverty line was set at a shockingly low consumption expenditure of just 62 rupees per person per month in rural areas and 71 rupees in urban areas. At that time, that was the mathematical threshold for absolute bare minimum survival. Anyone who couldn't hit that level of consumption expenditure fell below the poverty line, or BPL.
But let's fast forward a bit to 2011 and 2012. Based on the Proft and Dulker Committee recommendations, inflation forced some massive adjustments. The poverty line suddenly jumped to 816 rupees per month for rural areas and 1,000 rupees for urban areas. The cost of those basic calories and select items had simply skyrocketed over the decades. The baseline measurement had to adapt drastically just to represent the exact same level of biological survival.
But this brings our whole narrative full circle. This per capita income, it is literally the bare minimum for food. It does not provide for basic essential items like clothing, healthcare, shelter, or education. So even with those financial adjustments over the decades, this really strict poverty line measurement completely ignores the human poverty factors we discussed at the very beginning of this explainer. It's a measurement of survival, not a tolerable life.
And this reality ultimately traps people in what the economist Ragnar Nurske called the vicious circle of poverty. It's a brutal loop. Low real income means people can't save, low saving leads to low investment, which then creates a capital deficiency. And that lack of capital, it leads right back to low productivity and underdevelopment, essentially starting the whole cycle over again. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Now that we know exactly how to define and measure poverty, from raw calories all the way to multidimensional human metrics, how do we actually break the cycle that keeps people trapped inside it?